The Japanese Quince by John Galsworthy. As Mr. Nilsson, well known in the city, opened the window of his dressing room on Camden Hill, he experienced a particular sweetish sensation in the back of his throat, and a feeling of emptiness just under his fifth rib. Hooking the window back, he noticed that a little tree in the square gardens had come out in blossom, and that the thermometer stood at 60. Perfect morning, he thought. Spring at last. Resuming some meditations on the price of Tintos, he took up an ivory-backed hand-glass and scrutinized his face. His firm, well-colored cheeks, with their neat brown mustaches, and his round, well-opened, clear gray eyes, wore a reassuring appearance of good health. Putting on his black frock coat, he went downstairs. In the dining room, his morning paper was laid out on the sideboard. Mr. Nilsson had scarcely taken it in his hand when he again became aware of that queer feeling. Somewhat concerned, he went to the French window and descended the scrolled iron steps into the fresh air. A cuckoo clock struck 8. "Half an hour to breakfast," he thought. "I'll take a turn in the gardens." He had them to himself and proceeded to pace the circular path with his morning paper clasped behind him. He had scarcely made 2 revolutions, however, when it was borne in on him that, instead of going away in the fresh air, the feeling had increased. He drew several deep breaths, having heard deep breathing recommended by his wife's doctor, but they augmented rather than diminished the sensation, as of some sweetish liquor in course within him, together with a faint aching just above his heart. Running over what he had eaten the night before, he could recollect no unusual dish, and it occurred to him that it might possibly be some smell affecting him. But he could detect nothing other than a faint, sweet, lemony scent, rather agreeable than otherwise, which evidently emanated from the bushes budding in the sunshine. He was on the point of resuming his promenade when a blackbird close by burst into song, and, looking up, Mr. Nilsson saw at a distance of perhaps 5 yards a little tree, in the heart of whose branches the bird was perched. He stood staring curiously at this tree, recognizing it for that which he had noticed from his window. It was covered with young blossoms, pink and white, and little bright green leaves both round and spiky. And on all this blossom and these leaves the sunlight glistened. Mr. Nilsson smiled. The little tree was so alive and pretty, and instead of passing on, he stayed there smiling at the tree. "Morning like this," he thought, "and here I am, the only person in the square who has to come out and—" But he had no sooner conceived this thought than he saw quite near him a man with his hands behind him, who was also staring up and smiling at the little tree. Rather taken aback, Mr. Nilsson ceased to smile and looked furtively at the stranger. It was his next-door neighbor, Mr. Tandrum, well known in the city, who had occupied the adjoining house for some 5 years. Mr. Nilsson perceived at once the awkwardness of his position, for, being married, they had not yet had occasion to speak to one another. Doubtful as to his proper conduct, he decided at last to murmur, "Fine morning," and was passing on when Mr. Tandrum answered, "Beautiful for the time of year." Detecting a slight nervousness in his neighbor's voice, Mr. Nilsson was emboldened to regard him openly. He was of about Mr. Nilsson's own height, with firm, well-colored cheeks, neat brown mustaches, and round, well-opened, clear gray eyes. And he was wearing a black frock coat. Mr. Nilsson noticed that he had his morning paper clasped behind him as he looked up at the little tree. And, visited somehow by the feeling that he had been caught out, he said abruptly, "Can you give me the name of that tree?" Mr. Tandrum answered, "I was about to ask you that," and stepped towards it. Mr. Nilsson also approached the tree. "Sure to have its name on it, I should think," he said. Mr. Tandrum was the first to see the little label, close to where the blackbird had been sitting. He read it out. "Japanese Quince." "Ah," said Mr. Nilsson. "Thought so. Early flowerers." "Very," assented Mr. Tandrum, and added, "Quite a feelin' in the air today." Mr. Nilsson nodded. "It was a blackbird singing," he said. "Blackbirds," answered Mr. Tandrum. "I prefer them to thrushes myself. More body in the note." And he looked at Mr. Nilsson in an almost friendly way. "Quite," murmured Mr. Nilsson. "These exotics, they don't bear fruit. Pretty blossom." And he again glanced up at the blossom, thinking, "Nice fellow this. I rather like him." Mr. Tandrum also gazed up at the blossom, and the little tree, as if appreciating their attention, quivered and glowed. From a distance, the blackbird gave a loud, clear call. Mr. Nilsson dropped his eyes. It struck him suddenly that Mr. Tandrum looked a little foolish, and, as if he had seen himself, he said, "I must be going in. Good morning." A shade passed over Mr. Tandrum's face, as if he, too, had suddenly noticed something about Mr. Nilsson. "Good morning," he replied, and clasping their journals to their backs, they separated. Mr. Nilsson retraced his steps towards his garden window, walking slowly so as to avoid arriving at the same time as his neighbor. Having seen Mr. Tandrum mount his scrolled iron steps, he ascended his own in turn. On the top step, he paused. With the slanting spring sunlight darting and quivering into it, the Japanese quince seemed more living than a tree. The blackbird had returned to it, and was chanting out his heart. Mr. Nilsson sighed. Again he felt that queer sensation, that choky feeling in his throat. The sound of a cough or sigh attracted his attention. There, in the shadow of his French window, stood Mr. Tandrum, also looking forth across the gardens at the little quince tree. Unaccountably upset, Mr. Nilsson turned abruptly into the house and opened his morning paper.